And really good news is I'm going to introduce someone who's one of our best presenters, and the wonderful Betsy Parish, who's going to talk about a really important subject, which is around optimizing learner success through differentiation. And we know this is a challenge for teachers around the world, and it'll be really interesting to hear what she has to say. Betsy is a teacher educator at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the US. She supports pre-service and in-service teachers around the world in the online MA TESOL program at Hamline and as a professional development provider. She's been involved in the development of state and national adult ESL standards in the US. So she brings a huge amount of experience to this subject. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Betsy.
Great. Ben, thanks so much for that warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here, and it's just wonderful to see where all of you are. I've had some experience myself outside of the US working with teachers in Bangladesh, India, France, Russia, Vietnam. And I found that this topic of managing multi-level classes and then differentiating instruction accordingly is something that everybody is concerned with. And I think we're particularly concerned today as we're moving between face-to-face, hybrid, online. We're teaching in a lot of different modalities and ones that are new for us as well as for students in our classes. So today we're going to think about the dimensions of multi-level. What does multi-level mean? And then we're going to look at 3 dimensions for differentiation, looking at content, product, and the process of instruction. And I'll define each of those in turn in a bit. And I hope that you leave this session with some ideas about how you could differentiate tasks, activities, lessons in your settings. But let's just do a quick poll. I'd like to know a little bit about who's here today. Eve's going to set up a quick poll for us, and we want to find out, do you teach mostly face-to-face now, mostly online? Are you working with secondary learner students, adults? Are you teaching English as a subject area? Or are you teaching in a content-based setting? And also, do you think your classes are multi-level? So we're going to just do a quick poll here for a moment and get a sense of who you are and what you do. Because I was focusing this on secondary to adult, I did not include primary as one of the levels. I know some of you may also teach at the primary levels. And actually the things that I'll talk about today I think could be applicable with different content in your classes. So Eve, I think we can go ahead and see what we find. We're gonna look at our poll results. Okay, so it looks like you're teaching, so close to half of you are teaching mostly online. Only about 20% are teaching face-to-face now, right? I think this represents the trends that we're all feeling. It's the same thing in my context for teacher education. So it looks like 40% of you say that you work in multi-level classes. I think as we define what multi-level means, that number might go up at the end. We'll see. All right. Thank you so much. We're going to do another poll. So this time I want you to think about the learners in your classes. Check all that apply. So do learners have different expectations about teaching and learning? Do they have different levels of virtual and digital tools in learning, different comfort levels, different levels of literacy, oral language, access to English outside of class, different personalities, ways of being in the world? And do they have different motivations for learning English? So we'll take another moment here and see what you think. This one takes a little more thinking than the last one, so let me give you a moment. All right. All right. So we're going to close the poll now, but just be thinking about those characteristics as we go forward. Right. So I think that close to 50% or more than that are finding these characteristics, these differences in their classes, right? So multi-level means much more than just proficiency level, right? Multi-level is different, you know, proficiency, yes, it might be across domains. For example, some students might have really high oral skills and struggle more with literacy, or the opposite, right? But learners also have different experiences with education. Some, you know, may have extensive prior formal schooling, have studied a variety of other languages. In my context, and I notice there aren't a lot of people from the States in this talk, but I work with a lot of teachers who teach newcomer, refugees, and immigrants. Minnesota has the highest number of refugees per capita in the United States. So we work with a lot of students who come with varying levels of educational experience. Some with very advanced academic skills, some with lots of informal schooling, but not a lot of formal schooling. Certainly, so cultural background certainly comes into play. And a lot of different individual factors. Now, like my setting, as I said, there's going to be a lot of difference in terms of culture and backgrounds. If you're teaching English, let's say as a subject area to college students in Argentina, there might be more commonalities in that regard. But even so, each individual brings different lived experiences. They live different preferences for learning. And they all have different situational factors as well, especially now. You know, students will have varying access to technology. Let's say, you know, you're doing a lot of online learning and you're trying to use a lot of these new tools. And, you know, learners, they may have limited broadband at home, or they might have 3 or 4 different people in their family vying for the equipment as the children are learning at home while the parents are working online at home, and then also trying to learn English if they're studying English with you. So a lot of different variables make up our multi-level class, don't they? So what we're going to think about today is, in order to address the needs, we want to be intentional about our differentiation. And Tomlinson and Imbo, who are scholars and really known for the work in differentiation, they suggest these 3 components: content, process, and product, which I will look at with you in a moment here in turn, each of these in turn. Their work is focused on K-12 education here in the States within a public school setting, in content area classes like maths or you know, language arts or geography or whatever, physics, and we're going to apply that process to the language classroom here today. All right, so content is, what do the learners need to know and understand in order to be successful in your units, lessons, your curriculum. And this can be content knowledge such as economics or numeracy, but then as language teachers, it's also then the language you need to be successful for the specific tasks that you're working on and the content you're dealing with. So that's the different language forms and functions, vocabulary, everything that goes with expressing yourself in a variety of ways. So we can differentiate content in many ways. We can vary the level and complexity of the content. For example, we can have a more novice approach as a more expert approach to a topic depending on your learners' backgrounds. We can also vary the complexity of the texts we provide. Even consider that while maybe you typically have students look at authentic articles, but then some students struggle more with those. Maybe you can find an authentic infographic that is more scaffolded because it's represented visually. We can vary the modality. In other words, we might not always, maybe you have typically been using articles, but send students to go watch a video interview that corresponds to the same topic, for example, or go listen to a podcast. And then provide choice of topics within a larger theme. So for example, one of my teacher candidates that I worked with had students doing a research project on career options locally with her high school students. They got to choose the career sector, and then within their teams, they chose which aspect of that they wanted to explore. So some chose to look at the training needs, job prospects, salary, or benefits for those jobs. Okay. Then we can also differentiate the process, which is how we teach. This is about our instructional decisions that we make. So the types of tasks that we use, and then how we expect students to engage in our lessons. Okay? So we can do this in a variety of ways. First of all, we can vary the complexity of the tasks that we provide. So anything from something more scripted to more open-ended, or we can do with listening tasks. Maybe students only check off ideas that they hear while others are doing a more open-ended version of the task with note-taking. We can vary the scaffolds that we provide. So some students, for example, they might answer questions about a story. if something is a narrative, or this could work with if you're doing something more technical like a process text describing a process. But other students might read and fill in a graphic organizer like the one here on the right. We can also vary the roles and responsibilities that we assign to students. So some students could become more like they could do the teaching, they could be facilitators, they can be guides for others. So we're going to look at a couple of samples which will show you these more vividly. And then finally, we need to consider the products. How are we assessing that learners have met our learning outcomes? Do they write an essay? Do they make a presentation? We can adapt these end products. We don't have to have a one-size-fits-all. To be more inclusive, we want to provide learners with options for demonstrating their understanding of the outcomes for a particular lesson. So this could be done by varying the complexity of the final product. So for example, if you do writing, some students, they may write with a paragraph frame where you give them sort of a skeleton of an essay with some of the, let's say, the key academic terms in there, and they fill in the content. Or you might vary the quantity and the depth of responses for a final product. We can also vary the modality. Some students do something in writing, some do audio, some do video. And then we can vary the type of final products. So we could do reports. They might gather information and create a graphic representation. They might create a podcast. They might, record a Q&A, like a mock radio show. And those are all ways that then with the right assessment rubrics that you choose, these performance-based assessments can be easily differentiated, okay? So I think performance-based assessments in general lend themselves much more to a multi-level class and lend themselves much more to differentiation than pen and paper exams that's we think of traditionally. Now all of this is then based on the learner readiness, so how well prepared are they for the content, the skills and the language demands of your classroom tasks. What's their interest? What are they into? What do they know about? So that's something as you get to know your learners more, you can be mindful of as you make decisions. And then how do they approach learning? Some might have different learning preferences or cultural expectations about teaching and learning, and this will vary among your learners, right? So you might be saying, how can I do all of this? How can I put all of this together? I want to assure you that it's not about applying all these different elements in every lesson. What I'm hoping is that you leave here with seeing what the possibilities are and thinking intentionally about these elements of content, product, and products by design, differentiation by design, not just leaving it up to chance as you're in the middle of a lesson and you realize something is really difficult. It's getting to know your learners. Right? Now, this is getting harder in the online environment, clearly. We need time to get to know learners. It's harder to read your students, isn't it? When they're behind a camera or you're working through other online modes. But as you get to know your students better, I think it really does become easier. Okay? So we're going to take a look at a couple of samples now. And one thing I want to note is that everything I'm showing you, I'm going to use 2 examples that are designed for teaching in the online environment. Okay, maybe a Zoom class or on Google Hangout Meets or whatever platform, your Schoology, whatever platform you're using. However, everything I show you, you could also use in a face-to-face class, okay? And then also if you think, that content, that topic, I don't find that particularly interesting. However, you could use the same steps. All the steps that I show you can be used with any content that you're teaching. So this example is going to be with high intermediate to advanced level students, looking at the theme of we're talking about issues around the pandemic. They're going to synthesize information from multiple sources, identify inequities during the pandemic, and then propose some solutions to a problem, okay? So again, these could be outcomes in a lesson around a variety of content areas. It wouldn't just have to be about the pandemic. All right, so the learner profile. So this unit, the activities I'm going to share with you today, the first one, for example, is inspired by a teacher I've collaborated with in Massachusetts here in the States, Laura Porter. And this also depicts a kind of a typical adult education class here in the States. So this is what you're taking into consideration as you make your decisions. Some have interrupted or limited prior formal schooling. They have varying literacy and oral skill levels. They have varying levels of comfort with the digital tools, so we need to be mindful of that, and then varying access to the tools and really different cultural backgrounds. I do realize that for those of you teaching English as a subject area or teaching in an English medium school around the world, your students are clearly going to be, there's going to be less of the variation that we have here. But again, I think you'd be surprised how much variation there might be that you're not aware of. All right, so this was a lesson, a unit on what are some of the what's happening as a result of the pandemic. What is it revealing about inequities? And I think, these are images from the United States, but I think that you may be able to note some of the same issues in your own country. So who's most affected by the pandemic? Now, we're not going to do the how piece yet. That's more part of the discussion the students would have. If you could just jot your answers here. I see, okay, the homeless, just take a minute in the chat. I think please just write like a one-word response. When you look at these images, who is most? Retired people, the homeless, okay, day workers, right? Older people, a lot of people are noting that. Lower income, okay. So what this helps to show us, we can kind of, we use the term essential workers, and it's a great way to sort of problematize that, like who's deemed essential and who's most affected. And then those of us who get to sit at home and work online have the privilege of doing that. We are not facing the threats of the virus as much as others who are out there working in shops, healthcare workers, right? So these are examples of 5 areas where people are particularly affected. And the pandemic has revealed a lot of this, some of these social issues, right, that are more profound and that have always been there, right? But the pandemic has revealed this. So we're looking at a really, really critical issue. Now, one thing I want you to notice here right away with our paradigm of content, product, process, already think about the content here. By using images, we can think of the images themselves as a type of text. We can kind of read the image to find evidence to support our claims. So I think we often think of using pictures and images with lower level learners. However, I think this shows us that by using the right images and really provocative images, it's a way to allow all learners to explore a topic in depth, even if they don't have as much language to talk about it. Now, let me share there's options here. So learners could do what you just did for our process. They could type their response in the chat. It could be, I just saw someone said teachers. Yes, we are affected by this, aren't we? We could type answers in the text, all right? So the chat leverages the strengths of learners with stronger literacy skills. Also, they could write one word or they could write sentences, and either one is acceptable. So again, that's a way to differentiate. Now, concurrently, let's suppose some students aren't really responding much. You could be making statements, and students could just do a thumbs up or a thumbs down as you state an issue. For example, it seems that the elderly are particularly affected by the pandemic, and they could do a yes, no, sort of a thumbs up. So that represents what you might do in class with yes, no cards or agree, disagree cards. You could also have them eventually open their mics and share out. Now, in our class here of 2,600 people, right, we're not going to do that. But in your classroom, you certainly could do that. And all of these steps, they serve to scaffold and provide some time to think about the topic before we break them into breakout rooms for discussion. So that would be the next step. So the students would continue their discussion, who's most affected by the pandemic and how, and then they would now have time to discuss that in their groups. Now, I'm going to share a more extensive group assignment, though, around these themes here. So I chose one of the topics, like one of the sub-themes there. So exploring issues and proposing solutions. You could use the steps now for any one of those, whether it's incarcerated individuals, it's the homeless, it's frontline workers, healthcare workers, teachers, whatever you decide. But I'm going to show you some steps that will help the learners think really critically, analyze the information, and problem solve. Now, I think that if you think about it, this is perhaps more of an issue in the US than in some other countries. And that too could be interesting for your learners to learn about the United States. In other countries where the elderly often live alone, they often live in assisted living. So this would be a non-issue for many of you. I know that from my work and living. I lived in France for many years. I've traveled a lot. I realized that this is not so much of an issue. But even if people are living at home, my friend and colleague in Costa Rica, Lily, shared that even her mom, even though she's with her and nearby, she's in a different part of the house. So this is an issue for all of us, perhaps. These are headlines that I found. The coronavirus might break the nuclear family. That wouldn't be a bad thing. So the idea that wouldn't it be great if families lived closer together? Why has COVID-19 hit seniors so hard? That was another headline I found. And then seniors' health at risk due to isolation and loneliness. So I found these 3 different articles, and we'll just start like you typically do, start with the headlines, have the students make some guesses, some predictions about what each of those articles might tell us. Then they're going to get into breakout rooms for the next task. But now, as part of our differentiation process, we need to determine roles in these breakout rooms. In here, you can let learners choose or assign roles based on their strengths. These are just some examples of the sorts of roles, but I know, and I'm sure that role assignment is not a new idea for you at all. I think that it's just so imperative now that we are in this online environment where we might be teaching on Zoom. When we're in a classroom, we can physically float around and keep an eye on how things are going. Whereas when you're in a breakout room, you really are putting a lot of faith in the students to be self-directed, which of course they will be, but you need to give them some guidance for that. So these are just examples. If you have a very large class, reporters, the ones who are the reporters, they could be asked to send a text message or put a message in the chat to everybody with 1 or 2 big ideas that emerged in the discussion. All right, so here's the big task that we're going to do, and that is jigsaw. So jigsaw is one of my favorite approaches to working on reading and listening skills. So it means when you give different portions of a reading to different people in class, and you put the pieces of the reading back together, or it could be assigning different articles on the same theme. Jigsaw is just inherently multi-level because you can differentiate the texts that you choose. Some students could be reading an article, some could be listening to a video, some could be using some kind of, you could be viewing an infographic of some kind. So it's very easy to differentiate. And then working in teams with Jigsaw allows for different ways of interacting with the text. So through discussion, some students could be scribes, some can note the responses. So what you do is create teams of 4 to 5 students, and each team is assigned one of the articles. So we have article A, B, and C. And then this chart, we're going to look at what to do for breakout session 1. So in their first breakout session, this team looks at their article and they try to identify the problems that are addressed in that reading. So, they don't have to take a super close read. You notice it's not reading and answering a bunch of comprehension questions. You're really reading the text more authentically. Like you're looking for particular information. What are the issues? So, and especially when you're working as a team, then collaboratively, everybody's looking for different information and they're populating this as they're talking. They're populating this chart in a Google document. So I've been using shared Google documents a lot with my student teachers in my program, and then the student teachers in my program have been using this a lot with their learners. So you share the link to your Google Doc in the chat, one student pulls it up, or then they can share their screen within their breakout room, and then as a team they populate their Google document and their portion of the chart. Just as you would do if you were, say, doing this in class with a handout and people fill in their portion of their chart and then they mingle and they fill in the rest of the information. We can still do this in the online environment. And again, it's a great way to differentiate, right? All right, so now I'm showing you, this is what the Google document looks like. This is showing you the article A breakout session 1, the group identified these issues. Family members can no longer visit, the elderly don't have technology for communicating, and those living at home should, even if they are at home, they can't interact with their loved ones. So now the students, the same groups, you don't have to regroup people, it gets a little chaotic when you do that. That same group gets together again in breakout session 2, and now they're going to propose some solutions to the problems. So for example, for family members that can't do longer visits, maybe they can use WhatsApp to communicate, or maybe they can find people at the center, if there's staff who have the technology and can share it with the elderly residents. Maybe they could make some art and share it with their loved ones through the windows. Maybe bring the kids, bring the family, or maybe they could play music by the window, okay? So these are then the students have offered these suggestions, placed their name after their suggestion. All right, now sometimes students struggle with the language they need, the actual wording to make that thinking visible. And so in any classroom, but in particularly one that's particularly multi-level, I love to provide language frames as students are working. So if you're jumping between the breakout rooms, or if you're doing this face-to-face and you're listening in, then send a note in the chat privately to a student with some phrases that might help them. Kind of, if they're being kind of quiet, but you think maybe they just don't know how to express the ideas, we can give them phrases like these. Well, to lessen isolation of the elderly, families should, or families could, or to increase connections, the facility could. So give them the language frames they need to make their thinking visible, okay? So, all right. So some possible products for this one. There are a lot of different products, but here are some that I would suggest. They could write a summary, and some students could do that with a paragraph frame and some without, but they could also record a short podcast, okay? And they could record, like I said, this was my idea before, like a Q&A with a partner, pretending that it's like a radio show where they ask each other questions like, what have you noticed about who's been most affected by the pandemic? And then they share their ideas. And this could be like a round table, the group of 4 or 5 students could do this together. So then the key is that you sort of think about, well, what are my outcomes? What am I looking for evidence of learning with this topic? And then create either an assessment checklist or a rubric to do so. So there are others as well, and I'm seeing with so many of you here, I can't really, the chat's going by very, very quickly, but I'm sure you can think of other ideas as well, and maybe take these ideas along with the ones I've shared back to your colleagues where you work. So, but what I want to highlight again, these steps, we hopefully, heaven forbid, we won't be in this pandemic forever, right? Hopefully not too much longer, and hopefully we'll be back to classrooms face-to-face. So everything I've shown you could be used in a face-to-face environment, and again, with any topic. But I hope that you're seeing some ways that you could do some of those tasks you've used in the past, you hadn't thought you still could. I hope this has inspired you. So just to sum up, for this example, we had leveled text, varying text, types of text could be used. Now my example had 3 articles, but you could certainly find either talks, news reports, websites, other things, sources on the topic at hand, and then varying the topics based on student interest. For example, with those 3 articles, they could choose, they could self-select which group they want to be in. And another note, I often get this question, if you have a very large class, you can have multiple groups working with the same article. It's just that somebody is dealing with we've got representation for all 3 articles. And then notice that the verbal or nonverbal responses could be used, thumbs up, thumbs down, short answers in the chat, jigsaw, roles based on strengths, sentence, paragraph frames. So those are all the ways that we differentiated the process. And then products can be very different, okay? All right. So now let's see what this could look like at the beginning level. We're going to look at a different example for beginning level learners. Now this is a lesson, this might look pretty typical, kind of typical topic that we do in beginning level English language classes is talking about free time activities, using the simple present. But I want to beef that up. I want to make that a little bit more engaging. And so we're going to, students are going to collect information about their learners' activities. So in essence, you're developing a lesson where they practice the skills of collecting data, information about their classmates, and then analyzing the data and presenting the results either in a report or in a bar graph. Now, you might think that sounds challenging for beginning level learners, but I think or not, hopefully you don't, but I'm going to show you how this could work and how this could work in the online environment. Okay, my favorite new tool, and it's been around, I don't know how long it's been around, I just recently discovered Jamboard. And Jamboard, it's like a whiteboard. It's like Padlet, except it's more flexible and it's free, and it's an extension in your Google suite if you are a Google user. So Jamboard is it's a whiteboard with these different options of drawing and then erasing or pointing, doing a post-it, doing an image, or writing text. You have all these different options on the left-hand side here. Now, to start off with, what we're going to do is show how you can generate the content. We're going to do class-created content as an approach to differentiation. I mean, what better way to make sure you're meeting the needs of learners if they're providing the content for your lesson? You know it's of interest to them, and you know they understand the topic because they provided the input. So what we start off with is, first, I would model, personally, I'm going to use photos, and I would model by, as you see this icon, uploading a couple of photographs that share my weekend activities. So one of them is I like to bake. And so here I was baking. This example was from this summer. My son was visiting me from New York, and he was showing me how to make bagels. So I learned how to make bagels this summer. But I love to bake. So I also like to kayak. So here's a picture of me in my kayak with my husband on a lake in Wisconsin. So some students could do the same. If they have pictures readily available, they can upload photographs. Okay, now, but maybe they don't. And they could also then use Postit notes. They can just add a Postit note. So maybe they say visit family, I like biking, swim, exercise. So notice that the responses could be one word, the responses could be 2 words, or they could be a whole sentence. So that in itself is of differentiation, and you're okay, that's fine. So now we have more ideas. Now maybe there's some students who are really beginning level in the United States here in Minnesota. Actually, in the beginning level classes, we have a lot of students who are non-literate in their first, they're maybe pre-literate in their first language. They hadn't learned to read and write in their L1. They're really emergent readers, and so maybe they just want to draw pictures, so they have that option as well. So here we might have students who like to go on a boat, or they like to garden, for example. So now we've generated the topic and the content for our lesson on weekend activities, rather than using the pictures that are provided in a textbook that may not relate to students, they may not. And you know, if you're using a textbook, you could certainly go to the textbook on this topic next, but this is a great way to generate learner interest and input by starting with their real lived experiences. So now the activity to work on the grammar or to work more on the function of expressing likes and dislikes is all based on this learner input. So we're going to do 1 question survey as a task. And 1 question survey is where you might, you could have maybe 12 different questions or whatever, 6, 12, depending on the size of your class. And then you make questions, and for beginners, you could do yes/no questions, or you could do WH questions with frequency adverbs. How often do you exercise? Once a week, once a day, once a month, whatever. But let's just keep it simple to see that you can do these sorts of tasks with beginners. So do you like exercising? Yes, no. Do you like kayaking? Do you like biking? Do you like cooking? And remember, because of the pictures before, those ideas have been scaffolded. They've been presented to them among ourselves and by the students themselves. So now they're going to use any tool that's appropriate. So if you have students could poll each other in breakout rooms. They could, if your class isn't too big, they could read their question out and have everybody do a yes/no. They could, you could do a poll. You could set up polls for them and then send the results to them. So there's so many ways you could do this. And if you're back to face-to-face teaching, then you just literally do a mingle. You walk around and you tally your responses. So it would look like this in the end. So we have our responses. And now you're going to ask the students to analyze the results. Okay, so now the thing, again, the multi-level differentiation of processes, we might need to provide them with the language they need to talk about the data. So you might differentiate that as well. So some students maybe are comfortable just saying many people, or they could learn, if they have the language level or the skills, 3/4 of the class, or half the class, or 50% of the class. So you could weave in some work on numeracy as well, okay? And then give them the language frames they need for that. So here's their, analyzing the data. Now, then they're going to create a product. Let's look at their different products. Now, the one on the left here, and I showed you the whole screenshot so you knew how would this work. The student's end result would just be the chart with activities and kayaking, yes, no. But if you have learners who use Google Sheets and they know how to create a graph, great. Put that group together. And then they could take their data and create a Google Sheet graph. Wonderful. But you might have some students who aren't familiar with that, and that's fine. And they could go, oh my gosh, the picture, my image isn't showing. I'm so sorry. The one on the bottom right, as far as I can tell on my screen here, it has the 2 bars just colored in on Jamboard. So using Jamboard, they could draw their graph, right? And then finally, some students might be most comfortable still just writing, but you could give them some frames if they need them, or they could just write a paragraph depending on their level. So you're differentiating. So we found that most people like biking, or half the class likes cooking, for example. Okay? So again, here we differentiated by design. We didn't just leave it to chance, but we thought ahead about are the different ways we're going to differentiate so the content based on the learner-generated input. The whole lesson is based on learner-generated input. So they self-regulated the level of language, really, right? It was also presented graphically. We had text and graphic responses. You could have both. Students could put a picture and then put a caption. I'm doing some training with teachers in Vietnam right now. And as a warm-up, we didn't see each other in August. So to reconnect, I started a Jamboard and we shared pictures and then we wrote a caption. So you can use this for a variety of ways, the Jamboard. We have mixed modalities. We had drawing, speaking, writing, listening. We had varied communication tools. So we could use the chat, we could use the breakout rooms, the sentence frames, the scaffolds, and then our products, drawing with Jamboard or whiteboard, or creating a Google Doc, using Google Slides or using Google Sheets if they know how to do that. Or you could take a photograph and then share that with the class, or email it to the teacher and the teacher could share their screen, or they could do a written summary. Nothing wrong with that, right? All right. So again, all of this could apply to both face-to-face and online, but I just wanted to remind you and kind of highlight the different tools we used that I showed you today and that I've been using. And when I say I've been using, I want to be completely upfront. I'm a professor at a university, so I'm mostly working with teachers, but I have the great fortune in my job of having a practicum where we're site-based in many community programs. And so I do a lot of co-teaching with the student teachers. I'll sometimes teach the lessons while students observe or help out with students in the classroom. And then also these examples I've shared are things that I've been observing the teachers using. But I want to say that I'm using these in my teacher education classes very successfully as well. The same sorts of things, the differentiated warm-up activities, using shared Google Docs, using shared Google for Jigsaw. So again, I'm finding great success in these different contexts in my life. So breakout groups with role assignments. I think that's super, super critical to remember, more so than ever. Linked resources with a shared agenda. You could have a shared agenda for the day with all those different Google Docs you plan to use in one spot that you could send to students ahead of time, or have it on your classroom learning management page, or whatever you're using, whether it's Canvas or Schoology or whatever you're using, Google Classroom. And then use shared Google Docs for Jigsaw, for group presentations. Teach the students how to use shared screens. I mean, and things like I'm learning as I go teaching on Zoom, like how I have to have my settings in Zoom set so that I can assign other people to share their screens readily and just have that as a setting for that class. Jamboard and whiteboard with Post-its and scribing and drawing, all the different options we have. and then polling chat function for ongoing assessments. There are so many others, but I hope this gives you some ideas and some inspirations for your setting. So now I think we have time for questions, but before that I want to do a quick poll in closing before we go to our questions. So now, which of these are you most likely to try? Based on what you heard about today, which ones are you most likely to try in your setting? Learner choice of topics? Or maybe you're already doing it. You can certainly respond positive, or affirmatively if you're already doing this. Varying complexity of language, text, and task? Using scaffolds, varying roles and responsibilities, different modalities for different learners, different final products. So which of those are you most likely to try in your setting? Give you another second to think about that. Okay. I'm looking at your responses you're writing. It looks like you're really excited about Jamboard. It looks like you're, like you said, you'd like to do it all. So let's close it. And now we'll see, we've got, it looks like, let's see what's the most popular. Well, actually a pretty even split across the board. It looks like, but you seem to, the highest one is the idea of using scaffolds like graphic organizers and so on. Great. All right. Well, we're going to open it up for some questions now. Just to let you know, there are ideas. My text that came out last year with Cambridge, Teaching Adult English Language Learners, has a fairly extensive section on differentiation. And then these two texts here by Tomlinson and Bell are sort of classics on differentiation that I can highly recommend. So Ben, what are some questions that have come in?
So many wonderful questions, and we've got very little time. So I'm just picking out what I think are the most interesting questions.
Yeah,
I thought there was a good question here, which was, when students are given options for the sake of differentiation, they may choose the easiest one, writing words rather than sentences. Shouldn't the teachers push them to extend, or what?
Yes, well, I think absolutely. And I think that's, again, getting to know your students. I might even have a conversation with that student and say, I've seen your work, and let's try this option tomorrow. So absolutely, I would be, that can happen. Absolutely. But I would be paying attention, getting to know your students, and not letting, let's say, so to speak, letting them off the hook if you know that they're not pushing themselves enough, right? Sure. Yeah. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, another great question is, how can you help learners save face if they find the differentiating discriminating?
Right. That is such an important question. And I hope that, okay, so one of the things you notice that a lot of times I was doing the tasks concurrently and simultaneously. So for example, you can chat, you can put up your thumbs down. And so I'm not so much calling out, this group is doing that, this group is doing that. So I think that is something you have to be really careful about. And I would not use like rating scales for levels of readings. I think, I think that one of the things, this is a trick my son's teacher taught him in 4th grade, was that when you're reading for fluency and you look at the first paragraph of a reading, if there are more than 5 words you don't understand, that text is too difficult for you to practice your reading fluency. I might use tasks like that, like ask the learners, now rate yourself, how does this one feel for you? If you think this is too much of a stretch, then why don't you try this text here? So, right. But again, I think that learners want to be successful, right? And so I think it's being highly sensitive and not in any way making it really explicit to them necessarily, or naming it. It's about your differentiation. It's your role as a teacher to differentiate by design and provide the options. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. And one last very quick question is around assessment. There's been a couple of comments about if we're giving them differentiating the activities, etc. How do we make the assessment
that's
fair?
a great question. Well, did you notice that the examples I gave today were all kind of performance-based in a sense? I mean, writing an essay isn't so much performance-based as creating a podcast or creating a poster, but I think you could have a simple rubric that has the same outcomes. So for example, learners have evidence of whatever it is your understandings were or your learning was for that particular lesson. And so I personally think you could often use the same rubric for these different products.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that can, and sort of keeping your eye on what are your learning objectives. If you think back to my learning objectives were talk about daily activities. Okay, everybody did that. Collect data, analyze the data, present the data. So everybody did it. So they just did it in different ways. And if I were to have a simple checklist at the end, or have the learners even do a self-assessment of how they did in the lesson for the day, everybody could show evidence of meeting those objectives regardless of the option that they either chose or you assigned.
yeah,
Right?
no, absolutely. That's a great answer. And so I think we're going to have to draw to a close now because we're on a tight schedule. But I really wanted to thank you, Betsy. That was a fantastic presentation. I think there must have been at least 1,000 good ideas in that 40 minutes. It was really, really helpful, practical and also insightful. So thank you very much,
and
Betsy.
before we close here, also